Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Alumni are invited to join the Buckley Institute during reunion weekend for compelling events with top speakers. On May 25th, join us at 9 a.m. for free speech at Yale and beyond. On June 1st, Buckley is hosting a panel on campus intolerance, from attacks on free speech to antisemitism. Check out buckleyinstitute.com for more details.
Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale, the official podcast of the Buckley Institute. I'm your host, Ari Schaefer, Director of Communications here at the Buckley Institute. Just a quick note on today's episode. The panel was recorded before the 10 encampments began at Yale, Columbia, and a bunch of other universities. The interview with Sam Abrams addresses those at length. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. Normally, our panels are comprised of students sounding off on the campus issues of the day. Today, we have a special panelty of Yale faculty. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Yale School of Medicine Professor of Radiology and Biomedical Imaging, Evan Morris.
Hi, Ari.
Thanks for coming on. Yale School of Management Professor of Operations Research, Professor of Engineering, and Professor of Public Health, Ed Kaplan.
Hi, thanks for having us.
And Roya Hakakian, who is first and foremost an accomplished author, both in English and Persian, and is currently a fellow at Davenport College.
Good morning.
I brought you all on to talk about the topic of academic boycotts, what they mean for freedom of speech, and what they mean for academic freedom. Before we get into all that, you all were part of a faculty delegation of sorts of around 25 Yale faculty visiting Israel. What inspired you guys to go? What did you learn from the experience?
There was a trip by Penn faculty in early January, and they were the first academics to go to Israel. And I felt, as soon as I saw that in the news, it was something that we had to do. Our targeted goal was to learn about the effect of boycotts on Israeli institutions and Israelis and figure out what we as academics could do to respond.
Both of you guys, you wrote a piece in Newsweek about your trip, right, recently?
Yes, that's true. And one of the most important points was the complete absence of any notion of apartheid, which is often promulgated here. We were at universities where we saw Arabs who were vice presidents, Arab heads of hospitals, Druze professors, Jewish and Arab students who were learning together. Of course, the Israeli Arabs do have some demands. The demands were all in the service of more integration, not less.
A lot of Arab Israelis, almost everyone that I interviewed with, say we don't feel like second-class citizens, but yes, there is discrimination, and we want to participate in every way possible to reduce and eliminate the discrimination, but don't call us second-class citizens because nothing could be further from our standing in the society.
It's beautiful. I wanted to move on to the next segment of our topic of our discussion, talk about Israel boycotts, because that was the focus of our piece. I was wondering, would you be able to walk us through exactly what an academic boycott is?
Well, there's really two distinct approaches to boycotts. One is when organizations say formally, we're going to cancel invitations to Israelis. We're not going to work with Israeli institutions. That's A. It's reprehensible, but it's identifiable. The second, which people call soft boycotts, is in a sense more sinister and more destructive. And that usually refers to the refusal without admitting it by academics who are asked to review the dossiers of Israeli academics just because the reviewer objects to some policy of the Israeli government.
And I suppose what I can add is that it can begin with Israelis. It inevitably will affect, as it already does, affect Jews. And we know from the great words of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks that what begins with Jews never ends with Jews.
So I actually want to build off that point, because I was going to ask about how I guess the boycotters or the proponents of the boycotts really think about this issue, because what they're doing fundamentally is punishing academics or intellectuals or scientists from the state of Israel purely based on the fact that they are from the state of Israel. Do they not see that as wrong?
No, they don't see it as wrong. In fact, they see it as a fundamental part of their struggle. It extends from academic boycotts to cultural boycotts to sports boycotts, anything you can imagine. It exists right here at Yale. It exists on campuses across the United States. Since October 7th, a faculty organization called Faculty for Justice in Palestine has sprung up. It's obviously an offshoot from the Students for Justice in Palestine. But if you visit their websites, what you will see is that the boycott of Israeli academics is right up there at the top of their list of things they hope to achieve.
It's hard not to look at the timing of all of this and wonder, what are these people really thinking, right? A lot of this stuff started not weeks after Israel's invasion into Gaza or weeks after the military. Some of this started on October 7th itself, while a terrorist attack was still going on. What does it say about the people pushing this effort that they don't mind that 1,200 Israelis were massacred, raped, kidnapped?
I think the thing to understand is that this is not a series of seemingly spontaneous, independent realizations at campuses across the United States. This was extremely organized. Somebody built a big button and pushed it on October 7th. We know this for a fact. Many of the people who are participating in this honestly don't understand at all what the issues are. They've never set foot in either Israel or in the West Bank or in Gaza. It's all part of the same war. It's all part of the same campaign.
Well, I think they want to turn all Jews into pariahs. You can already see that in the way people hesitate to use the word Jew in their vocabulary or Israeli, or they dance around it. We've had some very disappointing statements coming out of Yale administrators about seeming to respond to events, but without actually saying the word Jew in them, for God's sakes.
Is there a correlation between how Jews are being treated and how Israel is coming under attack and how, say, Ukraine is coming under attack, or the 2022 movement of Iranian women and Iranian youth against the tyrannical regime in Tehran came under attack? I see these as movements that are occurring throughout the world in defense of democracy, free speech, and openness.
Evan recently wrote an article, an op-ed in the American Spectator, talking about boycotts of Israeli academics. And he said these boycotts, quote, undermine our search for truth. So are these boycotts anti-science?
Well, I would just say they're anti-reason and anti-logic and anti-data.
20 years ago, again, when this boycott issue hit the mainstream, as it were, the organizations which came out unequivocally opposed to such boycotts were exactly the kind of organizations the scientists look up to. The Royal Society in Britain, the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Boycotts are the antithesis of the universality of science.
And the boycotts are coming based on perhaps two fundamentally flawed beliefs: that Israel is an apartheid state and it's a colonialist state. This is a country, 50% of its population now is composed of non-European immigrants, which are made up of Tunisian Israelis, or, Iranians, Middle Eastern and North Africans, Moroccans.
We talked, Ed talked about, and I think Roy mentioned it also, these organizations that have decided to or called for academic boycotts of Israel. The American Anthropological Association voted for one back in July 2023. I think that was like their second or third effort at it. The group had confirmed to New York Times that they had never called for a boycott against any other state in the country or any other country in the world since their founding in 1902. World War II, they didn't call for a boycott against Nazis. Suddenly, Israel is the country that they've got to call out. And another organization, the American Studies Association, been around since 1951. Same thing. Israel was the first country they targeted. How do they even justify this? I don't even know the question at this point. How do they justify singling Israel out when they know that they've sat silently while so many other atrocities have happened, and a lot of Israel's doing is in self-defense in the first place?
I mean, at some point, we have to come back to the word anti-Semitism. I'm sorry to say it, but I just don't see it any other way.
20 years ago, I was involved in a study with Charles Small, and the study asked a very simple question. If you know that someone is taking strong anti-Israel positions, does that same person have a higher probability of being anti-Semitic? We took surveys, random, 5,000 people. Do you believe that the Israel Defense Forces deliberately target Palestinian civilians? Yes or no? But among the people who say yes to that question, what fraction of that group believes that Jews cheat in business? Statistically, much, much higher than everyone else. And that same basic pattern repeats over and over and over again. And in that sense, anti-Zionism very much predicts anti-Semitism.
Have you guys heard rumors, or is there any talk about broader momentum for a boycott among Yale faculty?
I have not heard any rumors of that. And of course, Faculty for Justice in Palestine is trying to be very, very opaque. They don't publicly tell you who their members are. Look what could happen at universities if, in fact, these boycotts become more established. You have in the academic setting, a notion of conflict of interest. Everyone is supposed to be able to provide an objective view when decisions are being made, especially when they regard the peers of professors and other faculty. So how can it possibly be the case that someone who has signed on to such a boycott could ever, under any circumstance, serve on a hiring, a promotion, an evaluation, or a tenure committee where the apparent conflict of interest is simply obvious, not only against professors who may have trained in Israel or be Israeli or are Jewish or who are known to be supporters of Israel? This can't happen.
We're on a slippery slope. Politics has already affected editorial decisions at journals. There are forced statements, whether they be DEI statements or other, that are being demanded both by universities and by government agencies like NIH. We as academics must recognize our obligations to our academic communities, and we have to stand up to say, you send me that dossier to review if it's in my field and it's someone, an academic in Israel, needs to be reviewed. You send me that paper. So I think there's a movement building both at Yale and nationally for a network of committed academics who say, I'm not going to let politics invade my profession.
So have you guys heard talk of boycotts of any other country on the planet aside from Israel?
I'm actually glad that Israel clearly is being held up to a much higher standards than so many other countries that we're not even going to mention because they're incomparable in terms of the absence of democracy in their societies to Israel. However, I think the irony of the boycotts is that when do they begin and where do they end? Do they begin at the moment we choose to? Or do we then say we're going to strip India of drip irrigation technology, which was given to the arid areas of India by Israelis, or water desalinization, and so many other things. And I think that doesn't just reveal the hypocrisy of the whole notion of boycotts, but also the impossibility of separating human beings and human inventions from one another.
So you mentioned that you're happy Israel is held to a higher standard. And I think it's then, your Irans, your North Koreas, even your Chinas. And I totally sympathize with that point. I mean, Israel is a Western-style democracy. I want it to be expected to recognize the rights of its people and to recognize the rights of other people. Can you think of any other country that's held quite to the standard that Israel is? Like, is it the U.S., do you feel, held to the same exact standard? The United Kingdom, France?
I can't
Dead
think.
silence in the room.
The silence is telling.
That's right. That's right.
Can students and alumni do anything?
The students or others, alumni, need to fill in the blanks. A few years ago, one of the great professors at the Yale Law School, Tony Kronman, published a book called The Assault on American Excellence. And in it, he argued that the university was making a mistake in dismissing Nicholas Christakis from his mastership and in also making changes of a lot of the names of buildings and so on and so forth. And that all of this added up to an era of fighting history and fighting the truth and, silencing speech. Students, alumni, everyone need to find how we go from there to this incredible rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism and the way in which Israelis, and I think ultimately Jews, are being eliminated from our academic spheres.
So I want to drill down on this because I realized I hadn't asked the question straight out about academic freedom and these boycotts. I know from a freedom of speech perspective, the Woodward Report, Yale's First Amendment, so to speak, there's a line in there that I always found particularly prescient in a document that's definitely worth reading, but they talk about how shoutdowns and disruptions are a violation of freedom of speech, not only because they deprive the speaker of the chance to share their perspective, but it deprives the hearers of a chance to hear that perspective as well. So I feel like when it comes to the academic boycotts, that's also what's going on here.
Look, I think you put the nail on the head, and that is that boycotts are a form, as you brilliantly suggested, of the heckler's veto, just on steroids. We're at a certain critical point in the history of Yale where we're about to choose a new president. And I would certainly hope that that new president is a vocal opponent of boycotts and a vocal and active supporter of the principles of the Woodward Report. And if alumni want to get involved, they should all be writing letters to the search committee demanding that the next president be out in front of the fight against boycotts.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Just want to thank you all, Professor Hakakian, Professor Kaplan, Professor Morris. Thanks so much for joining us all.
Thank you
for having us.
Thank you.
Now with that, let's get right to our interview with AEI's Sam Abrams, a good friend of the Buckley Institute. For today's interview, I'd like to welcome Samuel Abrams to Pod and Man at Yale. Dr. Abrams is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a professor of politics and social science at Sarah Lawrence College, and a faculty fellow with New York University's Center for Advanced Social Science Research. He has spoken to Buckley several times and is a good friend of the Buckley Institute. We've had the campus protests, the encampments the past couple of weeks. A bunch of them have been cleared out. Some have resurfaced. They've metastasized onto other campuses. All protesting against Israel. Are you surprised by any of this?
Not a bit at all. This is something that if you take a look at what's been said and how it's been said over the last decade, it's very clear that it was only the question of when was this going to turn on the Jewish community and on issues of Israel. It was only a moment of time till someone said, hey, wait a minute. These people are actually the oppressors. Let's go after them. And, we've seen that since October 7th. I marvel and just, stay up at night in bed almost daily now, wondering what a strange world I live in where I have to defend Israel's right to self-determination and to defend itself against those horrific attacks because logic and reason has fallen apart.
What stopped Jews in particular from seeing, the concerns behind the curtain here? Why did they think that, no, DI is good and like these things aren't going to hurt us? Like, why did they believe that, this wasn't going to turn on them?
I think that's a very important question and one we do not have a great answer for. I think in some regards, people were caught up in some group fervor, didn't pause to realize what was really going on. If we look at interviews we've had over the past few years about students when they participate in these protests, it's usually the same rhetoric. It's, I didn't fully understand it. The protests or the language, the actions didn't really fit what I believe is acceptable forms of behavior. But nonetheless, I did it because I think the larger macro point is important, or I didn't want to look like I was an outlier. I didn't want to be an outcast. I didn't want to be viewed as a non-participant. One thing I'd like to add, which I think is fairly important, is I met with quite a few different Jewish organizations. I sat down with a number of leading advocacy groups and tried to lay this out to them long before the massacre. The looks of disbelief that I was being given were shocking. So even centrist mainstream groups that cast wide nets, have big umbrellas, if you will, just chose to ignore what the text said, what these calls said.
So kind of on that point, like you look at polls of how Americans view Israel. More recently, they've quibbled with kind of how Israel is maybe prosecuting the war, but poll after poll since the beginning has showed that Americans support Israel over Hamas. It isn't even close. Those numbers get closer when you get younger groups of people, especially as you get closer to college age. There were early polls after October 7th that more college-age students or college-age Americans believed October 7th was justified and thought it wasn't. Why are America's young people so different intellectually from the rest of the country?
The answer is TikTok. The answer is Instagram. The answer is, and this is a big one, is that our institutions in this country have failed on so many levels. So young people have no sense of history. They have no sense of what is the truth in a lot of cases. So you have this vacuum, and young people like to be involved in a cause. They say this over and over and over again. We have ample polling data, which says people are looking to be part of a collective. They want to be part of a movement. They want to feel meaning. And this surfaces, and suddenly people have incredible meaning. I visited a number of the encampments, and one of the things that you see there is almost a sense of peace. Now, of course, they're shouting for violence and want to hurt folks, but at the same time, if you talk to the students, they're certainly no longer as anxious as they were. They feel like they're part of a community. And if you look over the last couple of years at what admissions offices are asking for and what colleges at the most elite level are asking for, everything's about agents of social change. I can't stress that enough. Yale and others are seeking out social activists. So we put wealthy kids who don't need money, who have huge amounts of support, who aren't working very hard, who have come in incredibly progressive, who are very comfortable and want to be activists. Again, perfect storm, cauldron to see this activism come up. And lo and behold, again, I didn't have a chance to visit Yale during the protests, but lo and behold, when you go to Columbia and NYU, these students are happy. They feel part of something. They feel like they're achieving a goal, and their faculty, their teachers, they're egging them on. The teachers are activists. The administrators are activists, and everyone is saying, "Go do this. This is great. You're you're doing something important. You're helping promote change." There was a quote somewhere, and I've never been able to find out who to attribute to, but something like Harvard receives more press attention than the next 100 schools combined, or something like that, and students know that. What happens in Cambridge and what happens in New Haven, people pay attention to. What happens in smaller colleges in Pennsylvania, where I was, a lot of people that sort of attention.
So while you're talking about the smaller colleges, you recently wrote on AI Ideas about the anti-Semitism at Sarah Lawrence. Why isn't more being done to protect Jewish students? In the way other minority groups have been protected and publicly supported by campus administration.
At Sarah Lawrence, the smoking gun is a little harder to prove. It's there, it's pronounced, but the faculty and staff, the administration, know how to get right up to the line without crossing it. I can't find an instance faculty members saying they want to, hurt me or kill me or cause physical harm, for instance. But they say very, very awful things, and they'll regularly invoke from the river to the sea, and they'll say Israeli genocide and all this. I think it's because Jews are viewed as a privileged, powerful class, and because of that, they're viewed as oppressors. And if you're an oppressor, according to a lot of DEI offices, you can punch up. Everything works. You can punch up on this crowd as often as you like. There are very few consequences, largely because the administrations and staffs and faculty are harboring these beliefs very, very deeply and don't want to change it. I also want to just add, as a caveat to that that's not everywhere. I look to places like Florida, and what they are doing to protect Jewish students is remarkable and deeply appreciated.
How do we kind of, I guess, thread the needle on free speech questions and the things that are being said at during these encampments and during these protests?
What I think people need to remember is that public and private schools are different. The rules governing them are different. We have rules on the books. We have rules about intimidation. We have rules about disruption. And the fact is, the schools absolutely have a right to say, you can't camp here, right here, right now. You have a right to protest. You can't camp here. It's creating a real threat. It's a disruption. You cannot do it. And they're choosing not to do it. And that's the real issue.
Some of the things you hear at these protests, from the river to the sea, Israel should go back to Europe, things like that. Mm-hmm. Like, are there things that you do hear at these protests that you've heard that you do think constitute threats?
If you look at a lot of these protests, and we know that a lot of these protests have outside influencers, outside mobilizers, and so on, this speech is not intended just to make a point. It is actually threatening, and we see violence actually occurring. If you'd gone up to Columbia, and again, it's a small minority of students, but they were violent. On campus, it could have led to imminent harm. If you look at UCLA, that stuff is crazy. That wasn't speech. They were. I mean, it looked like Austria or Germany in the 1930s. It was downright scary. And considering the fact that students were hurt, there was a young lady of Persian descent who I believe was knocked unconscious. That's what opened up the door for the violence either that night or the subsequent day.
So what are the kind of things that students or organizations like Buckley can do to kind of push back on this environment that's taking over our campuses?
Yeah, it's going to take a while. What's really needed, in my view, is a critical mass, campus by campus by campus. And that's why I love the Buckley model. Laura Noble said there was a certain percentage. It was a ridiculously high number. Was it
11%?
11%. Okay, 11% is a real number. This is not a joke. 11% is a great number of students, and it's enough to start having power. They can field candidates for student government elections. They can mobilize alumni. They can demand seats on the board through obvious electoral processes. They can build coalitions over time to fundamentally alter the culture. They can say, very bluntly, if there is a progressive event that forgets what viewpoint diversity is or something is out of whack, enough students can say, this isn't right, this doesn't work.
So I do want to turn to one other topic.
Sure.
I want to focus on academic boycotts. This is something that's kind of bubbling around. It's been around for a while. The idea, obviously, that they won't welcome speakers or welcome faculty. Campus agrees to not do any business with Israeli universities, not bring in Israeli faculty. The faculty agree not to review any papers, or a journal says I'm not going to review any papers from Israeli faculty or Israeli professors. Why do proponents of these boycotts, why do they think, punishing people purely based on their nationality is okay in this sense?
It's not. They're just brainwashed. It's, again, that woke mind virus. It's absurd. So the idea of invoking identity politics and saying because of someone's identity, we're not going to do this, or because of certain characteristics, we're not going to do this, there is no justifiable way to accept that. Imagine if I said, I'm not going to read anything if the person is Black or Hispanic or Japanese or gay or straight. It doesn't matter what it is. It's utter lunacy and completely unacceptable and antithetical to anything within the academic enterprise. Our goal is to seek truth. Our goal is to look at evidence, to look at data, to debate the evidence and data. I could care less who wrote it. If it's a good piece of work, it's a good piece of work, period. There's no reason to try to shut that down. And I think anyone who does, and you think about all the amazing stuff that's come out of Israel, from ways to various pharmaceuticals, anyone who believes that, should be out of the higher ed enterprise, because they're hypocrites and they don't understand what their entire purpose is. It's truth.
A lot of students, and I think probably the bulk of them, aren't showing up at these protests, aren't showing up at rallies, and are just trying to get through their college campus experience, get their graduate degree, play video games in the 20 minutes of free time they have, and then go on to jobs. But why is this something that they should care about? The shout downs, the encampments, and the increasing intolerance of free speech and debate. Why is this something that maybe if they have the energy and the will to kind of get involved in something, this is something they should care about?
Well, college isn't fun anymore. I had a lot of fun in college. Students are not having fun at all. No one wants to be surrounded by this level of toxicity, this level of animosity, and this constant hate in every direction. What a horrible waste of a wonderful moment in everyone's life. That's an important part. And at the end of the day, the biggest issue is people are paying a lot of money, whether you're on aid or not, to learn something. When I sit down with my students at the beginning of semesters now, we talk about ChatGPT. And I say to them, for instance, look, some of this software is adequately sophisticated that I may not be able to detect if you've used it for one of your memos. I'll probably pick it up on a longer research piece, but I may not be able to detect it if it's an 800, 1,200 word piece, something like that. And you can do that. I don't know what you want me to do. I'm not going to try to run it through a Turnitin program or something like that. But what I say to them is, you're shortchanging yourself. Why would you waste your time doing this and spending the money and so on if this is what you're going to do? You're not going to get a real experience that's fun, intellectually stimulating, and meaningfully educational. And I find that students actually immediately resonate when I say something like that to them. So many jobs today don't necessarily require liberal arts education. They don't require a great humanistic education. Google and others will hire you right out of high school if you can pass certain tests. There's a big move to say fewer people should go to college. We know this. You don't need certain skills anymore. So the idea of going to college is learning to be human. And that means having fun, learning history, and understanding how to manage the ins and outs of the world. Those critically important and wonderful tasks and goals of higher ed are being destroyed. So all students should say, hey, what am I doing here? Why am I at Yale if I'm not doing any of this? You want to be at Yale to hear from great thinkers, and that means your peers and the faculty. If you already know everything, you already know the answers. If the world is so easy because it's just done through oppressor versus oppressed, stop wasting your time and money and go do something now with it. When I lay that out with people, they usually all say, yeah, this is a horrible thing to do. What are we doing and why are we doing it? At the same time, I want to be clear, it's not fair to put this burden on our students to have to right this horrible wrong and to be the ones who are pushing back. But believe it or not, I think it's going to be once again the students that save the day here. And if we look at historical trajectories, think about Voting Rights Act, think about Freedom Summer, it was the students who push things forward, not the administration or faculty in most cases, but it was the students organizing. And it's a burden that students shouldn't have to bear. But I think that if we're really going to make change, the students have to demand change. Students should be saying to their professors, if it's only one sort of viewpoint in the classroom, you say, is that all? That's obviously not all. What else is there? What don't I know? What's the other story going on here? What are the other views that are not being presented here? The students should say, and they're beginning to say it, they literally say, oh, come on. There must be something else here. It can't be just that. There's a world outside of Bronxville that thinks very differently than what we're hearing in this room. What are they saying? What are those views and why do they matter? Why is the view that you're saying the minority view? And why isn't it the majority view? Students know better, and they really do.
And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale.
Pleasure.
Another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale is in the bag. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and always remember, for God, for country, for Yale, in that order.